Hello. So my name is Abedrabbo, and I'll be hosting this panel today on data pipelines and data mesh, where we are and what the futures looks like. The panelists today are two great speakers you probably heard today in the track, Zhamak and Tareq. And the speaker that you didn't hear today, Jacek Laskowski, who is the author of several books on technologies used for creating data pipelines, and who is someone that creates pipelines, data pipelines every day. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. So can I ask you to briefly introduce yourselves? Starting with Zhamak.
Hi everyone, I'm Zhamak. I work for ThoughtWorks as the Director of Emerging Technologies in North America. We, myself and a group of us at ThoughtWorks, kind of came up with the idea of data mesh a few years back, and since then has taken over my life, and that's all I do. I talk about data mesh and try to implement it for our clients.
Awesome. Tareq, can you hear us now? Is that okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Cool. Okay. So my name is Tareq. I'm a core data engineer at CMC Markets. My background has been in software development. I've had an interest in data for the last few years, and the whole sort of NoSQL big data stuff. And so yeah, I used to work for different consultancies as well, and now working more focusing on in a product company. And so we started on our data mesh journey around 6 months ago. So we're very excited about that.
Jacek?
Last but not least, Jacek Laskowski here from Poland. Sunny weather today. I've been with Spark for the past 5+ years as an independent consultant, and can't imagine any day, without doing more Spark, more Delta Lake, and Apache Kafka. So all around data, and I'm pretty excited to be among these, exciting speakers. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jacek. I have to say that several of my Spark problems I solved with Jacek's books, so it's an honor to have you here. You feel free to write your questions on the chat. We hope this is going to be very interactive. We are going to start with a few questions of our own, but I hope you can answer the questions from you as well. I think we should start, since this panel is about where we are and where we are going. Everybody knows that data engineering has lots of bottlenecks right now. So the promise of data science is still delivering all the promise it had in the beginning, because we don't have all the investment we should have made in data engineering in the past. So how do you see, what are the main bottlenecks for data engineering that you see today? Just to start the discussion, I know that data mesh tries to solve some of the problems, and probably Jacek, that builds data pipelines every day, knows what his problems are, what the difficulties that developers have to create scalable data pipelines and so on. So I just wanted to hear from each of you what you see are the biggest bottlenecks for the data space right now. So who wants to go first?
Zhamak?
Yeah, I can start. Of course, I'm biased towards view of the data mesh, so I have to say that. I feel like the image that I have in my head around where we are today and what are our problems is really a diagram, a graph that shows the inflection point that we're in. On the x-axis of that graph, you have this progression of the scale and complexity, right? We're getting data from more sources. The aspirations of data science and models that we have goes beyond a single data set within a single domain, within a single organization. It requires data from many different origins and places. And those aspirations are growing. We have more use cases. We have more, sources. So you have that complexity and scale growing on one hand, and on the other hand of the kind of on the y-axis, you have the impact of that complexity. Are we becoming faster to respond to our data needs? Are we getting more value from our data? I mean, are we resilient to the change of our organization? And I see that really we are tapering off instead of like going up and becoming more agile and get value. So we're at that really inflection point. And I think the challenge that we are kind of tapering off and plateauing in getting results, or perhaps declining, and that's why kind of we came up with, why don't we challenge some of these assumptions, is the some of those assumptions and those challenges are based on our assumptions that we've got to bring data all together in one place, one lake, one warehouse, or one team. We've got to build all of these pipelines so that we can get value. So immediately we've got a bottleneck. We have created a bottleneck, organizational bottleneck and a technology bottleneck. What if, the same way that we mesh APIs together, what if alternatively we could actually take our requests and queries and compute to where the data is and create this new notion of the data as a product so that we can really federate and decentralize this problem. And I think the other problem that we have is this separation of people who write the microservices and operations and know Kubernetes and people that know the data. There's like this bifurcation of both people and technology and skill set. So what does it take to have a generalist? I mean, Jacek, you're an amazing specialist, right, that you know these tools, but I would be actually curious at some point that what does it take for every generalist? Like we have proud to call ourselves sometimes we're a generalist developer, we are a full stack developer, right? There's that kind of, because we can move around, we're expert enough that we can move around. So what does it take to really elevate the data platform complexities or abstract some of those complexities so every generalist can be using data? Can we put the data science in a box? And we can kind of talk about how we can abstract complexity so the expert generalist can really address the needs of the data rather than a specialist group of specialist data engineers that we would never have enough of them.
That's a great point, because right now you need to be an expert on several tools to be able to deliver a data product, right? So Jacek, what do you see are the main difficulties for developers that have to create data pipelines, and what's the technology is still not delivering? What do you see?
Okay, when I was invited to this panel, I was worried that, all these questions are going to be very high level and architectural. And I try, even this, given my age, 40 plus, I still try to be very practical and very tool oriented. So I've been focusing on Apache Spark for the past 5+ years. And quite recently, a year ago, Databricks, the company behind Apache Spark, open sourced this great product called Delta Lake. And Zhamak mentioned this term, this architectural term, data lake, and and I can see proliferation of tools in this space now. There is this two Apache Software Foundation projects like Apache Hudi from Uber and Facebook's Iceberg. These are data formats for large data sets, and the last but not least, Delta Lake itself. So we've got 3 tools that try to solve the very same problem, having a consistent schema across different versions of this data, shared across different teams. There's this question from Florian in the chat about, what are our thoughts on this conflicting requirements of data scientists and other teams. And just this week, there is this conference, Data Plus AI Summit, organized by Databricks, the guys behind Spark and Delta Lake, and they just announced a new product to share large data sets in more unified and, so to say, streamlined way. So data scientists using different tools, data engineers can all benefit from all the data that was collected, in this space called data lake. And I started my speech saying that I try to be practical, not to say pragmatic, but definitely tool oriented. And my world is as wide as Spark plus Delta Lake or gave me this opportunity. So what I had just this morning, I had a call with a customer, and I was surprised that even given that Spark is on the market, 10 years already, they still with the very early versions of Spark, and I couldn't believe. Me thinking that Spark is all over the place. Everybody's using Spark, or at least heard about it. But I still, even after 5-10 years, see teams that only quite recently have heard about Spark. The tool they needed for. And so I had this call, and I couldn't believe that with all the years, with all the advances in how to manage large data sets, there are still people who don't even know about tools they could use for problems they have. Now there was this term, machine learning, AI, data scientists, all these great terms. I keep hearing all these words, all these phrases, and I'm worried that I'm biased, saying like, following, this bias of Zhamak. I'm worried that the more I'm in this data pipeline world, the far I am from my customers who don't even started their data journey yet. And this panel, I was worried that my experience might not match expectations of my customers and our audience, because they usually it's like people need recipes for how to do stuff better using more efficient tools. I had this thought. So yeah, that's my take on it. I hope
that's but that's probably actually the problem, because right now when you're starting your data journey, you have so many options of architecture tools, and there's so much fragmentation that it's really a challenge to choose your path and
exactly.
And finding people to actually guide you on this is also very hard. I don't know how is the market in your countries. We are each from a different country here, but at least here in Brazil, I'm based in Brazil, it's very, very hard to find good experienced data engineering, data engineers or data scientists or senior people experienced on different technologies and architecture. So there's also a problem in the market of finding these people. So Tareq, do you want to have your opinion?
Sure. Just very quickly on the main blockers point, I think it cannot be explained by the technology, because you can take any space in data, for example, and you'll find multiple alternatives that are possible to adopt somehow. With the cloud, there's a large choice, so it cannot be the technology itself. From my personal experience, what I saw is that the organizations I worked with, one thing is that there is a focus on the technology actually, which is trying to find a technology-based solution to all data problems, but also a lack of understanding that, as an again bias, the data is central, and the problem is more about the organization and the people around it, and the data is what is actually durable. So I saw a few organizations, for example, who want to adopt data science, and then they get data science team, but they have absolutely no data engineering capability to get the data to the data scientists. In terms of the having multiple choices and so on, I think this is, it's a bit of a problem everywhere, and this is the bit earlier in my presentation. There will always be some skills that are niche, more or less, and I think some of the data engineering aspects beyond the specificity of any tool, but things like designing a system that is resilient and fault tolerant and so on, will require some level of specialization. So especially around that, what we do is having these people actually, this works very well with a more like squad-based and iterative delivery model. So we try to match both, where we know that we cannot always have someone who's competent in all data engineering aspects on every single squad, but we can have cover different things at different points in time. But I think this will always be a struggle, similar to what we saw in DevOps and cloud engineering and so on.
Yeah, another aspect that maybe you can share some light on how you're solving the problem is that there's a huge gap between experimentation and production of data solutions, right? So Jacek, for example, probably when you're creating a data pipeline, someone has to give you sample data to experiment and create, and then you have to deploy this actually in production. And depending on how you do it, it's like doing everything over again. So it's very common today to experiment using Jupyter notebooks, for example, but then you have to deliver this in production. And how do you keep this, because you're going to re-implement or use an architecture to run the notebook in production. And also thinking on data mesh architecture, when you're creating your data pipelines, you have to find this data that in organizations become more and more data all the time. So I see, Tareq, that in your presentation, you're using data discovery tools for that, but then the data discovery has to be made for experimentation and then for production, but there are different security concerns on both of them. So, and this is huge for us to have productivity in creating these products, right? So how do you see that? How do you solve this, or is there a good solution for that? So how do you see this problem of actually developing the product and then using this in production?
If I may, I'm after, yesterday was the first day, day one of this Data Plus AI Summit, where, products which could address problems you mentioned, help solve. And among them is something they called Unity, or, Databricks Unity, or I'm not sure about the name, but there is this product they designed, or they thought might be, relevant to some teams, data teams, where there is data catalog, kind of like Hive catalog or Hive Metastore, where you can just query for all available data sets. I mentioned already there is this brand new protocol, again developed by people behind Apache Spark, and who work for Databricks with other companies. They developed this open source specification for sharing large data sets. So looks like something I haven't thought much about, because I'm more practical in a sense that, people are telling me what to do, so I'm doing it, rather than thinking, just like architects might be doing all day long. So while being busy with Spark and seeing no end with me pushing, Spark to teams, I see there is a need for orchestration, data discovery, and all these, high-level concepts. And looks like it's only yesterday, when Databricks, the company behind, all this, large data, complex processing, they only now push this new products to the market. So it looks like this, what you mentioned, is very new, brand new, space to explore and address with new tools. And I'm yet to learn more from these tools about the problems people might have. It might also be that many teams I've been in touch with, they don't even know they are having problems, because no one told them they are struggling with something you mentioned, just like data discovery. It's like me, very often when I'm doing something and I don't see I'm repeating myself over and over again, until someone come and say, hey, why are you repeating this and that? You can just automate it. Why don't you do this? Or why don't you use this? And it looks like, problems you mentioned are they are new to me, but not for others. So yeah, again, there are new products from Databricks who, just announce them. My take on it.
I can follow up on what Jacek, unlike Jacek, who's actually spent all his day on the keyboard writing,
Yes.
I spend my day pondering and thinking. So
glad to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really looking at what is it are we doing? I mean, so the chat asked me, how do you respond to the doubters? And I would say, well, I would just give you this quote from Dao, that if you don't change direction, you may end up where you're heading.
Yes.
Which is the challenges we've had, no matter what shiny tool we get. And I'm actually a big fan of kind of Databricks folks and what they've done and their contribution to the open source. So I think the tooling is a part of it. What I would say is that, again, pondering what things can we fundamentally change. You had two maybe questions, Fabian, in what you posed to us. And one was around kind of discoverability, right? Ability to kind of find data. And then the other one was the difference between like kind of what it takes to have this product quality, production quality data. And I think there are two fundamental kind of characteristic assumptions that I would like us to rethink. One is the fact that data is unintelligent. Data is bits and bytes that we dump into a sink. We read from one sink, you have this intelligent pipeline code, and then dump it into another sink. So it's just dead bits and bytes on the disk or on the stream. And then what do you have to do to make that data discoverable, useful, understandable? You build all these fancy systems outside of that data to bring intelligence and usability to it. As opposed to, let's invert that model. Why data? But why can't we now define a new unit for data, a new concept? I call it data product. I'm not super happy with the name, but that's what it's called. The new quantum, a new unit that encapsulates not only the data, but also that intelligence, the code that makes the data maintainable. Maybe that's a pipeline with it, the code that makes all the metadata that makes the data usable, the documentation. And yes, if you want to have a fancy tool on top that gets that information out and then gives it in an aggregate view so you can search it across many data products, it's possible. I think we've got to shift our thinking from data as a byproduct of something that we dump somewhere and somebody else needs to kind of figure out how to actually make sense of it, as really data as a product. And that means a very new unit of architecture than how we think about data. It's not files, it's not tables, it's that and the code that makes it usable and movable. So that's I think one aspect of this discoverability. The data inherently needs to include all of those information and the capabilities. And then the other aspect was around kind of product quality, this experience of making this unusable product data a usable product. And I think if we now think about data and code as a new unit, then you can apply all of the CI/CD practices that we've had in the microservices or operational world to that unit itself. So you can manage and verify and attest the quality of the data, as well as test the code that is managing that data. And that code very well might be a Spark job or a Spark pipeline. But that's a new unit of architecture that can be verified, built, tested, deployed, and really apply CI/CD practices that we've been applying for decades.
And maybe we should start answering the chat, because we have lots of questions here. And I
think Tareq might have something. I'm sorry, I'm not the
sure.
But you were violently shaking your head, so I wonder if you wanted to say something.
No, it was an agreement. But just to add very quickly an engineering perspective to what you said about the data as a product. As an engineering problem, it doesn't start and stop at just coding the jobs. Part of the engineering problem is making it usable for the organization. So this does include the development lifecycle, testability, deployment, all these things. So in our case, again, you need to rely on sound technical foundation where you have CI/CD, automation, multiple environments, what have you. Then you have to work with the people to understand how that actually would work for them and what is the life cycle, because different teams have different life cycles in terms of getting the data, doing something with it, and then building product. So actually we include that as part of the engineering problem we are trying to solve. This is what is engineering. It's solving problems, and the problems are a tiny bit technical, most of the time organizational and people related as well. That's it.
That's a great point. So let's start with the first one. Maybe should each one of you answer one, because we have lots of questions. So we just want to make sure we answer as many as possible. What are your thoughts on the seemingly conflicting requirements of data scientists and data mesh, having all data very quickly versus having proper data products?
Yeah, so in fact, I disagree with that question. And I feel that question comes again from an assumption that you made at the back of your head when you asked that question. What do data scientists really care about? I work with a lot of data scientists. I go to a lot of data scientist talks. And at the end of it, regardless of all these beautiful models that generate, they say this disappointing sentence that we didn't have the right data to tune this and actually deploy it. So what they care about is ability to experiment, go from a question that would this model answer this particular question, to find the data that they can explore, to discover, to very quickly learn what that data is, to actually trust it, know that it has the quality and integrity that it requires, and then be able to use it. And yes, they need data, many data sets of different kinds that can be stitched together. So data scientist doesn't care if you physically put that data into one lake. I mean, it shouldn't care. What they care is that those affordances that they can easily discover, use. So that's the idea. The idea of the mesh, in fact, is that we can get that instead of waiting for some centralized data team to build the pipelines to give the data far away from the truthfulness of the data, where the data actually came from, through some pipelining. Later on, let's get them as close to the source as possible, give the power and autonomy to the source to actually share that data as quickly as possible, as close to the source as possible, but yet have the mesh interconnectivity so that when you go and run a search or explore function on your mesh, you can see all of the data products. And just the idea that it is a data product doesn't mean that it will take a long time. I don't know why that assumption was made, so I'm curious about that. But if you ask every data scientist, they also say, oh, I spend 80%, 60%, whatever, do data wrangling, do the data cleansing, to change the data. Well, that wrangling and cleansing needs to be delegated, decentralized back to the sources of the data. So the data should be really usable when they get it. So in fact, I disagree that that because you have a mesh, you have a conflicting requirement. You just have to see that requirement implemented in a different way that removes some of the challenges that data scientists they have today. But with the caveat that from technology and implementation, we're still a few years away from that beautiful target state, right? We have to work with our technology providers to actually have the tools that exist perhaps today. I mean, the delta sharing that Jacek was referring to, or Sparks, these are very wonderful tools. They just have to be reconfigured in a different architecture.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question here around the architecture of data mesh. Is there a case study that you can share where a client moved directly from a siloed data to data mesh without migrating to a centralized data lakehouse first? Maybe Tareq, I don't know if this was your case.
Again, this is my own personal understanding and interpretation, and the way we interpret data mesh is not a technology recipe that you just implement, and it does not dictate what technology you use. Architectural and organizational approach that puts data at the center, and in that it shares some of the ethos of microservices, for example, where we used to look at services as just monolithic applications, and then things became more decentralized and then more collaborative. Now, one thing that is, again, we are lucky with in our context is that the backdrop is a transformation initiative, because data mesh requires a change in the mindset or a shift, or that is not just the technology. You need this remit or background, if you want, to be able to implement something that goes beyond cosmetic changes to the technology and beyond just linking up some let's say data lakes or silos. That would be great to link so on, but for us it wouldn't realize the promise of the data mesh. So again, I see it actually as an enabler, but then there's the question, as an enabler it requires some believing, so to speak, that there will be a different and positive outcome, and an investment. It's not something for me that will give you so-called low-hanging fruits or immediate gains, but in terms of the approach to implement it, we're obviously trying to focus on identifying the big problems and the important things and so on, and then turning this into multiple implementation initiatives or components or projects that actually add up to something coherent. And this was a bit the idea that again, I mentioned at the end of my presentation about the data mesh itself as a product, because it's a thing, but it's not, it's a target state and it's a journey, and you have to imagine the concrete steps on the journey. It's probably a journey where you never get there. It's a continuous refinement, basically.
Something about that question make me a little bit suspicious. So I'm gonna maybe try to double click into that. I don't have a case study where people didn't have data lake, didn't have data warehouse. And the reason for that is the people who are now going to the data mesh, they did have those. They were at the forefront of the technology and data-driven, transformation. So they invested in the warehouse, invested in the lake, and they have pain points, so that now they're trying something new. So if your organization doesn't have any of those, or maybe it has it, but it's in the silos, then I question, does your organization have a data-driven strategy? So that's the question in the back of my mind, is that if you weren't a data-driven, you don't have that data-driven strategy, aspirations, if your CEO doesn't envision certain functions of your business changing using ML, and then I would be suspicious of using data mesh. However, you might say, no, we do, but just for some other reason that I can't think of right now, we haven't invested in those approaches. And I would say, if you have the engineering capacity, if you want to bring those data experts like Jacek into your organization to actually build that technology for you, then there is not a problem to go back right to the source rather than rely on some interim lake or warehouse. In fact, in a way, it might be easier for you because you don't have a legacy to deal with, right? You can go to the source and start creating those data products as a point of sharing your data.
There are a few questions around the roles in the company to work with data. What's the role of a data owner? Or there's a discussion of full stack developers. So just to summarize all the questions, how do you see a company has to organize themselves in terms of roles to either implement data mesh, or Jacek, if you can say how the companies you consult with, how are they organizing, what works best?
I'm gonna disappoint you with my answer because, from my practical point of view, people are struggling with very basic concepts, and hearing all these high-level concepts, I'm really, how to say, not surprised, but I'm really astonished by how well we named all these problems, yet we've got almost no solutions or easy solutions. And my clients usually say, hey, Jacek, we hire you because we've got problems, whatever you call them, solve them. And I say, okay, I've got only a hammer called Spark. If you need Spark, or I can just guide you, how to use it. But if you need, some architectural design or some kind of business transformation, that's definitely not my case, and I can't help you. So, hearing all these, nice concepts, observability, discoverability, all these abilities, made me wonder, how little I know about problems of my clients, focusing solely on Spark, Delta Lake, and thinking I am in this data crowd already. It's like amazing. I thought I know a lot, yet given all these great speeches and answers, I'm so little, and I'm not even close to. I'm wondering what I'm doing here. I can't help you unless you ask something about Spark. So my clients,
I think you represent the present very well, because as Zhamak said, data mesh is still missing lots of tooling and even some technologies to make it easier and real, right? So it's good to have a present perspective, so that we still have lots of things to address, right? So that's the interesting point of this discussion. We have only 2 minutes, so if you can briefly, one of you, Tareq or Zhamak, just explain how the teams are organized to put data mesh in production, and then we can go to the Hangouts and continue from there.
I'm happy to give a brief overview of what we are doing. So one is the core data team. It's important to mention what we are not. We are not the data police, so we are not there and we are not the data implementers of every single thing in the organization. We are enablers, because many of the data mesh concerns are quite cross-cutting and require bridging gaps, and also investing in some core capabilities like the low latency bridge I mentioned, or data discovery and what have you. Some of the other roles are already exist in the organization, but I think they need reframing with a data mesh perspective. So, for example, as an owner of a data set currently, how do you become a data owner, and what are the responsibilities about understanding what data to share, and what metadata to advertise, and so on. There are obviously cross-cutting discussions about finding a common language. Consumers don't have to just go around and wonder what to do. And also, in a self-service perspective, the responsibility of data consumers to go and, when they discover what data they need and where it is and the characteristics and so on, to consume it and adapt it to their requirements. So a lot of it is there. It just requires framing and nudging in the right direction. And again, it's a long journey, so I'm not saying that this is where everything is now. This is what we're trying to head towards.
Excellent. So we have to wrap up, but we can and we should continue this conversation, the Hangout session, because it's very interesting. And we didn't answer all the questions, but if you can go to the Hangout room and repeat the question over there, I'm sure you can take them. Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot. Very interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure's all mine.